Okay, thanks so much. Welcome again to our another seminar series. I think we have about 5 left for the term. And we welcome Professor Suren Pilay from the CHR. I don't know if many of you may know about the CHR, quite an exciting center for thinking about theory and developments in South Africa. And Suren, I'm fortunate. I just told him. Of course, in anticipation of his coming, I had to read one of his latest papers on constitutionalism and democracy and what that made possible, what it limited, and I just found it incredibly inspiring. And I think so. It's not an overstatement to say that he's one of the most, among the most exciting, thinkers at the moment in South Africa. So we're very lucky to have him. I messed up the schedule; we nearly missed him, so I'm glad that he actually came. And he also says he's been here again after 10 years or something. So, or maybe longer.
How long Stephen has been here?
Yeah, as long as Stephen's been here, that was the last time he came. So we actually
something wrong, obviously.
Yeah. So yeah, we're actually welcoming him back. So thank you. Yeah, thanks for coming.
Thanks, Shaheed, for the invitation to be here. It's been a while, but I'm delighted to be back, and in some ways. To share with you very preliminary thoughts that have been prompted by events in the South African universities of late. I suppose one of the questions that I'm interested in is how these debates have reanimated discussions on colonialism, brought up debates about what it means, brought up debates about how we overcome colonialism. And I know, of course, it's the topic of the moment. In some ways, it's the topical topic. But to my defense, the other day I was going through my papers and I discovered an op-ed I wrote in 1998 that was published in the Mail and Guardian called Affirmation of Academic Colonialism. And it was after attending a very heated seminar at UCT in the Center for African Studies when there was a huge debate going on there about curriculum. So I hope I'm not joining, at least in my defense, not adding to the mushrooming of the scholarship that's just arriving. Although it's great that there's all this new scholarship that is happening, I think it's both an exciting time, it's a challenging time, of course, for many of us having to engage these debates and being challenged ourselves by our students, which is wonderful. So I think I see it both as a kind of space of critique, a moment of critique, and a moment of renewal. My talk here today is going to address a current of thought, really, that has animated many of us as a framework through which to think the problem of colonialism and its aftermaths, or if you were to follow this school of thought, not its aftermaths, but its presence, in the sense that we have not gone beyond colonialism, we are very much living its present. I'm of course referring to what is called decoloniality and the decolonial school, and I'll describe some aspects of this important critique, and then offer some preliminary thoughts on what I consider to be productive about it, but also what I see to be the limitations in thinking the problem of colonialism in Africa, and I want to be specific about that, in Africa, particularly the parts of the continent that have experienced indirect rule colonialism. So I have a few worries that I'm going to express, and I'm going to do them in a very unnuanced and, to let Shaheed down, unsophisticated way, because these are just really thoughts that I'm thinking out aloud and hopefully to get feedback on. So I think my worries are fourfold at the moment. One, that the school of thought, when imported here, projects the Latin American experience onto the colonial experience tout court. In other words, onto the experience of the globe as an experience of colonialism. Two, I think that, and this is quite explicit by its proponents, it deliberately rejects being historically specific for a good reason, and therefore, in my view, does not historicize its concepts. It collapses all categories of difference over time and across space into a single logic. Lastly, it discourages what I see to be a gesture of comparison, both as an ethical gesture and a dialogical, a pedagogical practice, through which we might intellectually work towards undoing Eurocentric ways of thinking the world's pasts and the world's futures between different locations of the global south. So let me start in some ways with a short narrative on the familiar, on the conjuncture as I see it. I know there's been a number of new books by scholars who also have happened to have occupied senior management positions in South African universities, who've reflected on the student movements and who have reflected on its limits and its possibilities. These are not my preoccupations here, either these books or necessarily saying something about the student movement. But I'm speaking in relation to it and through it and drawing on it in some respects. In March 2015, as many of you know, student protests erupted at the University of Cape Town, focused on the removal of the statue of Cecil John Rhodes from a prominent position on the campus. The moment and the movement quickly spread to other campuses across the country, including this one, and found resonance in other parts of the world as well. It was not the first time, of course, that student protests had occurred in post-apartheid South Africa. There had been numerous protests preceding this. And after this event, which we might describe under the banner of Rhodes Must Fall, the major issue that mobilized students across the different campuses was a different banner under the hashtag Fees Must Fall, which was a demand, of course, as you know, for the scrapping of fees at the 26 public universities in South Africa. What was distinctive about this wave of protest, symbolized by the campaign against the presence of the statue of Rhodes, was the way it brought attention not only to who was getting access to the university, but it was drawing attention to what was being taught in the university. There was a structural production to the current crisis. As one student leader during the campaign put it, I quote, "We want a complete shift in thinking in and about the curriculum. It can't be Eurocentric anymore. We need a curriculum that is about our continent and not just the negatives, but the positives as well." Another student added, I quote, "Where are the black lecturers, the black non-academic staff? You move from one office to another, one class to another, and all you find is either a white or a colored lecturer. They don't understand our situation as black students." And drawing attention to the question of language, another student noted, "When we speak about decolonization, we speak about the curriculum speaking to us, not to white people. Let's learn in Xhosa, sociology in Xhosa, psychology in Xhosa." Xhosa is the dominant, of course, black African language spoken in the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape, with Zulu, Tswana, and Venda making up the majority of languages in other provinces, animating similar kinds of questions across campuses in those regions of the country. One of the important dimensions of the moment of the student protest was also a very deliberate decision by the student groupings who led the movement to reject the leadership of the youth and student wings of the dominant political parties, especially those affiliated to the ruling African National Congress. I quote, "The era of the ANC is over," stated one student. "This is not a rainbow nation, but a divided nation. Black people now have realized their call. The rainbow nation is not working. We have to move ahead with the struggle. The struggle must continue. We will continue fighting. Black people are tired of the ANC, tired of white capitalist monopolism," and so on. The heterogeneity within the student movement and its competing ideological disputes aside, this was a moment that found resonance, but was also a reflection, I think, of changes within the South African Academy since 1994, and these are the structural features that I'll quickly describe. In the 1950s, the percentage of black African students as a proportion of the total students in higher education was 5.7%. In 1983, it was 18.1%. In 1994, it was 47%. The number rose to 71% in 2015. Between 94 and today, the actual number of students in higher education doubled to just under 1 million students. But of that number, only 14% of the total number of black African youth are enrolled in higher education. Despite this low percentage of overall enrollments, we have had a doubling of the student numbers. So first generation university students have entered the system on a mass scale, so to speak. In short, the majority of the population, which was left out of higher education, was now entering the university system, which had been severely racialized under apartheid. The demographics of the university teaching staff was a reflection of that, with a general average of 86% of academic staff across universities still being white in 2015. When the student revolt happened at UCT in 2015, that university did not at the time have a single black African female professor on its staff. That has since changed. One of the most powerful currents of critique through which students and some faculty have come to articulate the moment is through decolonial theory, as I've said. The decolonial turn, or decoloniality, has become a theoretical lens and a language through which the present moment is being described, and through which prescriptions for how the university and its curriculum should be transformed. When the student I quoted above diagnosed the problem as, quote, the dehumanization of black people, he was also articulating a diagnosis that decolonial theorists had been eloquent in rendering visible as the problem, not just in South Africa, but as a global condition of oppression and exploitation. The changes I have described above as structural changes of enrollments have also gone alongside various attempts by academics in small pockets of efforts to transform the content of knowledge in the South African academy over the last 2 decades. But these have been highly uneven and variously heterogeneous, some successful, some not. Many have been insurgent and experimental. Some have found support from their institutional planners and managements. Many found resistance and hostility. Some of the students who found languages to question the dominant and hegemonic form and content of the university have to some extent been the products of these changes that some academics have been experimenting with over the last 20 years. I suspect that many of you might be familiar with decolonial theories, but let me quickly give you some sense of what its proponents argue. A movement of thought, it largely emerged in Latin America in the wake of the Cold War and in relation to critiques both of Marxism and of modernizing thinking on development. The work of Arturo Escobar and others went alongside the work of Walter Mignolo. Its distinctive intervention, according to one of its most forceful theorists, the Argentine scholar Walter Mignolo, was that it makes a distinction between colonialism and between coloniality, a distinction between decolonization and decoloniality. Ascribing this distinction to the senior scholar among the group, the Peruvian intellectual Aníbal Quijano, Walter Mignolo describes the importance of the distinction as such. I quote, "First, and given this distinctive theoretical frame, grounded on the colonial history of the Americas and subsequently of the world, Quijano proposed that the decolonial task consists in epistemic reconstitution. He meant that on the one hand there's a civilizational rhetoric in the sense of persuasive discourses of salvation being the west of Jerusalem, I'm quoting, former Western Europe and the US, and the Savior, and then the rest who were in need of salvation. Salvation, he argued, has several designs, all coexisting today, but that unfolded over 500 years ago, since 1500. Salvation by conversion to Christianity, salvation by progress and civilization, salvation by development and modernization, salvation by global markets and democracy and neoliberalism. Thus, the rhetoric of modernity is the constant updating of the rhetoric of salvation, hiding the logic of coloniality, that logic being war, destruction, racism, sexism, inequality, and injustice. All, he says, the bad things that people notice today in the world cannot be changed to improve while modernity, coloniality, as he puts it, remains in place. I wish to underscore the importance in decolonial theorizations of this distinction between colonialism and coloniality. Colonialism is of limited valence, they argue, because it sees colonialism as a historically specific moment, an event, while coloniality refers to an ongoing epistemic and ontological order that is more enduring and more pernicious. Decoloniality, as I understand it from the writings of Quijano, Mignolo, Grossvogel, Maldonado Torres, and Enrique Dussel, is quite explicit in rejecting a historically specific conception of colonialism that is interested in its political and administrative aspects, or in thinking of it as a practice of identity politics. As Grossvogel puts it, quote, "One of the most powerful myths of the 20th century was the notion that the elimination of colonial administrations amounted to the decolonization of the world. With juridico-political decolonization, we moved from a period of global colonialism to the current period of global coloniality, as he describes it. As you will note, it is the question of epistemic reconstitution as the fundamental problem that structures modernity as a continuity of its violences and of its racisms. For Grossvogel, this way of thinking about modernity illuminates the contemporary racism in a different way. Racism is a structure here in thought rather than specifically confined to a modern biological conception of racism that we might say emerged in the 19th century and so on. As Grossvogel puts it, racism is a global hierarchy of superiority and inferiority along the line of the human that has been politically, culturally, and economically produced and reproduced for centuries by the institutions of, and I quote, capitalist / patriarchal, Western-centric, Christian-centric, modern colonial world systems. Okay, where am I? So people classified above the line of the human are thus recognized socially in their humanity as human beings, and thus enjoy access to rights, to human rights, to civil rights, to women's rights and or labor rights, to material resources and social recognition, to their subjectivities, identities, epistemologies, and spiritualities, while the people below the line of the human are considered subhuman or non-human. That is, their humanity is questioned and as such negated. And he quotes Fanon here. Here Grossvogel draws on the influential text of Fanon, in particular in White Skins, Black Masks, to mark out what he calls the zone of being and the zone of non-being. Racism is a hierarchy of superiority, inferiority along the line of the human. The hierarchy can be constructed and marked in diverse ways. These can be westernized elites of the third world, whether they be African, Asian, or Latin American, who reproduce racist practices against ethno-racial groups where, depending on the local colonial history, they were considered inferior or below the line of the human and can be marked as religious, as ethnic, as cultural, or as colored, or color line, or along a color line. This formulation of the problem as epistemic, of racism as a more abstracted feature of modernity, rather than a historically specific classification and the zone of being and non-being, has been taken up by a number of younger scholars in the South African Academy since the 2015 moment. Among the most thoughtful, energetic, and influential of these scholars is a Zimbabwean historian and a friend of mine who relocated to South Africa a few years ago. He teaches at the University of South Africa, the largest distance learning state university in the country, and has participated in events organized by Mignolo and others. He has subsequently established what is called, and some of you might know about it, or participated in its events, the Africa Decolonial Research Network at the University of at UNISA, which was founded in 2011. Sabelo Ndlovogachene explains the background to the organization as such. I quote, "At UNISA, just like other universities located on the African continent, we were accustomed to consuming academic material from the West. There was little awareness of rich local African scholarship and local knowledge production. I found that we needed to shift the geography of knowledge as well as the biography of knowledge. So the first thing we needed to do was to establish who the decolonial thinkers are in Africa and establish what their contributions have been and still are. Initially, as he narrates it, Adern was a small group of researchers from different departments such as development studies, political science, philosophy, communication science, and criminology, who were also at other universities. In 2012, he said a few members of the group went to the International Barcelona Summer School on Decolonizing Knowledge and Power, organized by Roman Grossvogel. The following year, the executive dean of the College of Humanities at UNISA also went along and supported a number of other students to attend. Another current of thought, of course, alongside decoloniality, which has had some influence within the South African Academy since 1994, has been interested in thinking about colonialism, knowledge, and race. And that has been through a number of different strands. One strand being influenced by older African debates on the African continent in the post-independence period, people who were looking to the early debates at Ibadan in Nigeria, at Dar es Salaam in Tanzania in the early 1970s, at Makerere University in the similar period. And the other strand is in some ways been influenced by post-structuralist critical theory and post-colonial theory, both of which I won't go into much at this point. But I do want to suggest that both those who have been recently drawing from the well of post-colonial theory and those drawing on decolonial theory turned to alternative theorizations in the wake of a feeling that a certain kind of Marxist theorization of colonialism and apartheid that was influential in the South African academy was no longer adequate to thinking the problem and the politics of race and of becoming post-apartheid. There was and is a shared unease about the valence in these critiques of political economy that was dominant amongst the previous generation on the continent, from the likes of Samir Amin and others, and the limits of its intellectual capacity to think through ongoing relations of power and manifestations of political violence. I could not help, of course, but notice that a number of the scholars who had presented in previous seminars here of late, I think some of the scholars that Bernard had invited, Andrew and others, have been some of the scholars who had been heavily influential in the South African Academy for many of us. As Ndlovu Gacheni puts it, I quote, "Marxists dismissed the issue of race just like they dismissed the question of ethnicity as a form of false consciousness. That race was part of a part of the structurally constitutive dimensions of colonialism elided them. When the Soviet Union collapsed, their narrative was pushed to the background. The 1990s witnessed the mushrooming of post-colonial theories, but he argues decolonial theories, which are traceable to the very colonial encounters, have been refusing to be totally displaced. No wonder why they have returned to the academy today as part of resisting coloniality. Race was not in the past, it was in the present. The decolonial intervention brought back issues such as knowledge, epistemology, questions of humanism, organizations of people into racial hierarchies, and the invention of colonialism. The idea that knowledge has been colonized transformed us from consumers of knowledge to critics of Eurocentric knowledge, he argued. Gacheni and Ndlovu's rejection of post-colonial theory draws on the critique of that current of thought that was developed by decolonial scholars like Ramon Grosvogel. In a 2011 piece titled Decolonizing Post-Colonial Studies and the Paradigms of Political Economy, Grosvogel articulates his criticisms of both post-colonial theory. Sometimes he uses post-colonial with a hyphen and sometimes without, and for some of you familiar with this, there's a huge debate about the difference between that. And his other target in the piece is political economy. I have said something a little bit earlier about what the problem with Marxist overdeterminations found in political economy represent for the critiques of that line of thought. So I won't go into it again. And to a large extent, some of those disquiets are disquiets that I share. In his paper, Grosvogel's criticisms of post-colonial theory focused on the subaltern studies group. The paper opens with a reflection on a meeting that happened in 1998 at Duke University in the United States, which he had attended, and that brought some members of the South Asian Subaltern Studies Group together in conversation with the Latin American Subaltern Studies Group. He noted that he felt that subaltern studies was writing on the subaltern, but that it was not a subaltern perspective, which is what he claims the decolonial theories would rather offer. In other words, they would offer a subaltern perspective. He noted that, quote, with few exceptions, they produce studies about the subaltern rather than studies with and from a subaltern perspective. Like the imperial epistemology, and I'm quoting, of area studies, theory was still located in the north, while the subjects to be studied were located in the south. And when I read that, I was a bit puzzled, I have to say, by this critique, because it has been made of post-colonial studies by others, Ijaz Ahmed and so on and so forth, that the part of his critique was, one, that they were located in the north as theorists, And secondly, that they were mostly post-colonial theorist studies were mostly located in literature departments, and in his target here was, of course, Edward Said and Gayatri Spivak in particular. But as far as I could tell from the little bit of research I've been doing, if one wanted to play the game at that level, Maldonado Torres was based at Rutgers, Mignolo is based at Duke, Grosvogel is based at UC Berkeley. And all of them in some ways are coming from literature and ethnic studies programs. So I'll just park that critique there. But maybe somebody can help me understand that. Moving on, I think, secondly and more substantively, Grosvogel argued that post-colonial theory, due to its reliance on post-structuralist thought, remained within the Western episteme. I quote, by using a Western epistemology and privileging Gramsci and Foucault, they constrained and limited the radicalism of their critique to Eurocentrism. These debates, he noted, made clear to us the need to decolonize not only subaltern studies, but also post-colonial studies. As he concludes, I quote, the old division between culture and political economy as expressed in post-colonial studies and political economy approaches is overcome in decolonial thinking. Post-colonial studies conceptualizes the capitalist world system as being constituted primarily by culture, while political economy places the primary determination on economic relations. In the coloniality of power, which is his approach, what comes first, whether it be culture or the economy, is a false dilemma, a chicken and egg dilemma that obscures the complexity of the capitalist world system. And in so many ways, I find this attempt to bring the domain of culture into conversation with the domain of the economic a very productive gesture. But I also think that there are some serious misrepresentations leveled against subaltern studies and confusing slippages in his paper that he makes between post-colonialism and postmodernism in Grosvogel and Maldonado Torres, both Maldonado Torres and Grosvogel's descriptions of these scholars' arguments. Subaltern studies, we might say, is not substitutable for post-colonial theory and vice versa, and is a heterogeneous collective that emerges in India and that has a number of its own internal debates and fissures and points of contention. But my concern here is not necessarily to defend subaltern studies or post-colonial theory. I don't want to set up a contest between post-colonial theory and decolonial theory. I'm not necessarily interested in that. But I am interested in thinking the African present and its past in relation to colonialism. And in that sense, to quote the Senegalese philosopher Souleymane Bachir Diagne, I think we should do that by any theoretical means necessary. I find a number of the concepts associated with decoloniality then productive when thinking colonialism as a project of epistemic violence. I find in particular the concept of the colonial wound developed by Walter Mignolo as a persuasive way to hold on to the legacies of colonialism in the present. The colonial wound as a metaphor has enabled Mignolo to suggest that there is a psychic dimension to the damage wrought by colonialism on colonized subjects, a wound that remains open and therefore that requires attending to. The work of reparations, of justice, and of addressing the intangible ways of that colonial violence leaves its trace and trauma on colonized subjects is how I read the appeal of this concept to many of us. And to that extent, a number of scholars here have found decoloniality a useful banner under which to advance the debate on the decolonization of knowledge. But there is, however, for me, a limitation in drawing only on decoloniality as approach to thinking the African experience. It is not that one is suggesting that it is wrong, rather that one is suggesting that it is strongly inadequate. It would be worth marking out the historically specific conjuncture out of which decoloniality emerged as a critical intellectual intervention in Latin America, and the ways in which the settler colonial experience in Latin America of conquest and of assimilation produces a different inheritance and a different biography of colonialism. And the same gesture would be productive to perform in subaltern studies. As approaches and along with the older African intellectual debates, both interventions have been drawn on in the South African context to bring into view the centrality of the colonial project as central to the formation of apartheid. They are enabling the emergence of a different language to take shape, that will have a distinctive idiom through which to think about apartheid as a colonial predicament and to think of South Africa as then part of the previously colonized world. These arguments are marshaled, of course, against an older hegemonic liberal scholarship, as well as the revisionist radical economisms of certain kinds of Marxist thinking within the academy that tended to view race as epiphenomenological. The benefit to my own thinking on this question was the way the debates in post-colonial theory and in Pan-African scholarly forums like Codesria had illuminated the relationship between colonial knowledge on the one hand and colonial institutions on the other, and the ways in which late colonialism drew on theories of indirect rule in particular, which traveled via Henry Maine through figures like Lugard into Africa. My point being that there are ways in which both projects, subaltern studies in India and decoloniality in Latin America, emerged out of specific political intellectual conjunctures as interventions in specific debates, but have traveled and are translated in lively and productive ways. As Edward Said was to point out, theory travels. The challenge is to hold on to that specificity of the intervention defined by geography and history, whilst we simultaneously put them to work in other places at other times for different uses. It is the putting to work in a different conjuncture of moments that requires a relation to theory that, in my view, should eschew being mimetic, but reworks it in order to offer an intervention into a debate that is conscious of its current problem. That does imply also being able to draw a contrast effect, showing the contours of difference between one's current problem and the initial problem to which the theoretical intervention, whether it be decoloniality or subaltern studies, was developed and had its charge, so to speak, derived from that initial deployment. This formulation of how to think the conceptual and political genealogy of the colonial modern is drawn, of course, from the Jamaican scholar David Scott, who encourages us to think of colonialism as having both a general and a specific career, to be thought of as colonial governmentality in his view. It is therefore distinct from governmentality in its European iteration that Foucault theorized, and specific in its geographical and temporal career, and specific in the targets of its intervention. By that I read him to mean that it had both a common predicament across the colonial world, but specific answers to specific predicaments in different times and different places. To produce a history of the present, we would need to pay careful attention to the historically specific and sedimented aspects of colonial rule across time and space. Part of the specificity then of the African genealogy of colonial rule, specifically but not limited to its Anglophone iteration, is the relationship between epistemology and institutions. Something of less importance in Latin America, because rather than having to rule over the natives, settler colonialism in Latin America decimated the native. As an aside, I suspect that Mignolo, Grossvogel, and Mandondo Torres are strikingly silent about settler colonialism, and therefore the more abstract and historically less specific notion of coloniality appeals, because most of Latin America's intellectuals and politically its great anti-imperial figures and critics of Yankee imperialism from Bolivar to Castro are led by those who would have more likely had to trace their ancestry not to the largely decimated and now largely minoritized indigenous populations, but to Europe. European settler colonialism in Latin America was victorious. European settler colonialism in Africa was defeated. That's an important difference. But to return to my point, we might say that the relationship between knowledge and the techniques of colonial rule, the career of its translation into modes of government, into modes of rule, into political life, into administration through law and so on, is central to the African experience. These we may think of as intersections of power, culture, and politics. The Latin American experience is useful for making sense of how the colonial project thought the other and how conquest and assimilation were rationalized. But it is less illuminating for understanding the shifting rationalities of 19th and 20th century Africa as an account of, quote, how Europe ruled Africa. In that sense, its notion of power is repressive, but not useful for thinking about the production of new political subjects as a mode in which power works. In other words, conquest gives us a vivid sense of the repressive power of colonialism and its atrocities of extermination. It also gives us a historicized sense of the shift from the other from a religious other occupying a different ontology of being. The debate at Valladolid in 1551, for example, is a case in point, to the other as a racial subject, now constituted by social evolutionary biological discourses, as we see in the accounts of genocide of the Nama and Ovaherero people in German Southwest Africa. But somewhat differently, colonial technologies of rule preoccupy colonial administrators like Lugard, Shepston, and Gray. They give us a sense of how late colonial answers were increasingly projected into the manufacturing of new political subjects available for domination but not necessarily for decimation. These political subjects would be thought of as neither dispensable as Native Americans or Herero were, nor would they be thought of as mostly part of a civilizing mission, as the French called it in its Mission Civilisatrice. In the apartheid form of its colonial iteration, the late colonial manifestation was premised on the permanence of difference, the very basis of the policy of Verwoerdian good neighborliness. I have a section here where I go through education and apartheid with a view to just drawing out this difference in a more concrete way. And I would just like to say one of the problems that has been inspiring of decoloniality, in summary, for many of the student movements, of course, has been the idea that European ways have been fostered onto us as native subjects, and this is the problem that we are contending with. Illustrative of the argument is a 2018 piece by UNISA-based scholar Johannes Serotto titled Dynamics of Decoloniality in South Africa, a critique of the history of the Swiss mission education for indigenous people. And in it he uses Grasvogel as a framework, coloniality of power, coloniality of knowledge, coloniality of being, to look at the archive of the Swiss mission and of course to find statements made by those who formed the mission in 1903, which was statements that of course severely denigrate native ideas and so on and so forth amongst African people. The paper cites example from those thinking of those who administered and formulated the mission education agenda to confirm the argument. For example, in 1902, Reverend H.A. Junod, an eminent missionary anthropologist of the Swiss mission, wrote that although indigenous people and colonists were both human, they were different in terms of character, hereditary, and mental health. And Serotto noted that religion was also the marker of social hierarchy. Now, this is a very powerful critique of colonial education, but it is a critique of a specific moment, in my view, of the colonial project in South Africa. And I think this is one of the points where the translation of the decolonial project into the African context reveals its limits, its lack of historicization of the local, and its lack of thinking of temporality as both chronological and plural. It tends towards a limited view of what the career of colonial education was. There are broadly two significant moments, of course, in this biography that is important in Africa and in South Africa, in particular in the British colonies. The French colonies, as you know, had a different experience. The two moments correspond to changing rationales in the way imperial and colonial states had to change policies as a matter of tactic that would better ensure the ultimate goal of colonial government, which was order among the natives that could continue to secure its rule. The first moment was, of course, assimilation, the moment of such as the Swiss mission, when the tribal political formations were being smashed in the 17th and 18th century in order to advance on the territories over which the settler frontier could govern. After the 100-year-long war, the Xhosa were defeated in the Eastern Cape, and young men, as you know, flocked to the cities and the farms as taxation forced black South Africans into the wage and commodity economy. The Land Act was passed in 1913, but by 1912, Africans who have been through mission education, some of them the sons of chiefs, like Solomon Plaatje, were journalists, lawyers, doctors, and began to petition, of course, for the rights of man, of universal man, that empire had promised. If education and Christianity had taught them that they were entitled to equality, they politely asked, why was that equality being denied them? It was, in fact, Rhodes at the time who was a proponent of the idea of the franchise for civilized men at the Cape, that black Africans with a certain kind of education and a certain level of property ownership could vote. But this is my point. There was a turning point in this policy, and the turning point has to do with a shift in native life and conflicts in the settler community among white South Africans. There were struggles for hegemony between descendants of the British and of the descendants of the Dutch. the formations of associations by Africans who are the products of missionary education, such as the forerunner to the ANC, the South African Native National Congress, cast a worrying pall over white politics. The liberal tradition of white South African politics established its difference with Afrikaner nationalists over whether the native could and should be assimilated into European culture and Western ways. The liberal tradition held onto the idea of trusteeship and paternalism, but the increasingly dominant Afrikaner nationalists had a different conception of the folk and of difference. The leading proponent, of course, Verwoerd, had set up a 10-year-long study of a commission of inquiry into native education before the NP won in 1948, and he promised, while on the campaign trail, that he would personally take charge of what would now be called Bantu education. Education for Africans was taken out of the hands of regional authorities and of missionaries. It was centralized under the national ministry, and its expenditure rationalized. Optional, it was made for parents of Africans beyond the primary phase. The primary phase was to be conducted in mother tongue instruction and not in English. The guiding policy was now called separate development. As Verwoerd was to put it, when I am controller of native education, I would reform it so that the natives will be taught from childhood to realize that equality with the European is not for them. What is the use of teaching the Bantu, famously, as he said, mathematics, when he cannot use it in practice? The Bantu child must be guided to serve his own community. There's no place for him in the European community. For the Bantu, there are always two choices: discard everything Bantu in order to adopt a Western civilization, or remain Bantu and uncivilized. That one might remain Bantu with the Bantu languages as the medium of civilization, and that one's whole community might in this way reach a higher spiritual, social, and economic level. This is to them an unbelievably novel idea. In a paper published in 1953, coinciding with the Bantu Education Act, the major journal of political theory at the time, Theoria, Eileen Janse-Krieger offered a view titled Some Aspects of the Educational Pattern of the Bantu. I'm interested in this because this paper doesn't appear in the anthropological, ethnological journal. It appears in political theory, which is the domain of the universal, as you know. Knowledge of Bantu life was generally constituted as ethno-knowledge. The paper outlines her first-hand observational accounts at a trading post that she had spent 6 months at, of how the process of Bantu education is different to European education. She argues that learning for the native child is something that happens through different processes of socialization and so on and so forth. I won't go through it all because as anthropologists you are well aware of this argument. But what I'm doing is rehearsing a familiar argument, a literature in Bantu education, with a view to pointing out that this shift from assimilation to difference is missed in the decolonial gesture. And therefore it cannot be translated into as a straightforward proposition. The more I read Grossvogel's account of racism as a structure, along the lines of the one I've quoted above, the more I'm persuaded that we need an argument for historically specific comparisons rather. Otherwise, there's a very strong likelihood that the claims of decoloniality to offer what it calls pluriversality or diversality will become the object of its critique rather than a sublimation of it. Whilst he was mainly addressing a Southeast Asian audience, the Chinese scholar Quan-Sing Cheng, in his book Asia as Method, was instructive for me in thinking differently about comparison. As he pointed out, the historical process of imperialization, colonization, and the Cold War have become mutually entangled structures which have shaped and conditioned both intellectual and popular knowledge. But he wonders, why are such comparative analysis within the third world so rare, even non-existent? What needs to be done, he says, is to facilitate this change in points of reference. Even if the desire and means to shift viewpoints exist, on what grounds is comparison possible and productive? Opportunities for Asians to get to know each other intellectually are often intercepted by the structural flow of desire toward North America. And I would add, of course, that remains a problem on the African continent. The turn to decoloniality in an unproblematized way raises the need for comparison and translation in this part of the world as all the more salient. You would have noticed that in much of the current discourse, the problem with apartheid education is identified as the imposition of European or Western knowledge onto African subjects. I hope to have given you a glimpse of an argument that argues something different, that apartheid education after 1948 was less about assimilation than it was about difference, the rule of colonial difference, as the Indian scholar Partha Chatterjee has called it. This was still an imposition of a European worldview, but not the same as the claim the popular rhetoric might make. It is par for the course that some of our colleagues, of course, will look at this moment in the academy differently, as one of alarm, failure, and closure. And we may understand this. My argument is that we need to think about why the Rhodes Must Fall movement emerged. For example, at historically white English liberal universities, where settled and sedimented power relations are being shaken, where tremors are occurring in the most resilient foundations of the colonial project. In my view, the most resilient colonial disposition is in the liberal project in South Africa, a liberal project that has for a long time immunized itself from critique and self-reflexive humility. After all, there is its history, the defense of the qualified franchise for civilized natives, for its role in defending academic freedom, which incidentally only applied to white universities. There is its critique of Afrikaner nationalism. There is its salutary defense of human rights. It is here in the story that the liberal project tells about itself and in the quotidian everyday practices of how it conducts itself within institutional cultures that I think the most unsettling tremors have been felt over the last 5 years in the universities at the apex of South African liberalism. New and often younger, often black voices of critique, often female, have come to take as their target the most visible of the colonial, invisible of the colonial, its paternalism and its legacies of trusteeship. And this in some ways go to the heart of what makes the social sciences and humanities and the arts matter. Matter in the sense that universities are also embodiments of knowledge and power. We occupy that interstice between critical knowledge and authorized knowledge. This is precisely why critical scholars should be attuned to how class is reproduced in the academy, how difference is reproduced in its very specific ways, and one can draw on a long genealogy, Althusser, Bourdieu's study and distinction, and so on. I point this out not as an indictment of those of us who are part of these landscapes, but to acknowledge them as part of our inheritances, part of the moment in which we find ourselves as scholars, conceptualizing curriculum, guiding research projects, teaching students, shaping new theses, conducting our own research. A comparative approach does not render differences inconsequential, but as illuminating is for me an important gesture in this moment. For it encourages thinking about the apartheid project as a continuity and as an answer, a compromise even to a colonial predicament, not as a teleology, but a messy political question with competing answers at certain political conjunctures. One could say that this is all just a continuous story of the zone of being and non-being, but that would not illuminate the concrete effects that colonial categories of rule have in the present in their very distinctive ways, whether they be racial, whether they be ethnic, whether they be religious. One of the key theorists, and I'll draw to a close here, of indirect rule, Frederick Lugard, the colonial administrator who invented Nigeria as a political entity, had warned of the Indian disease of an educated class of natives. Strangely, Lugard is also the administrator who founded the University of Hong Kong between a sojourn in Nigeria and Europe. In Nigeria, Lugard became a proponent of not imposing European ways onto the native subject, and of figuring out how to unite a territory to be called Nigeria while dividing it along ethnicities in the south and religion in the north. The pioneering Nigerian historian Yusufu Bala Usman noted that, quote, colonial preoccupation with restoration and rehabilitation of cultural heritage tended to reify culture, robbing it of its historical dynamism. It actually perpetuates the ethos of dependence which it ostensibly intended to eliminate. For Usman and others in Nigeria, these are legacies of how difference has become codified within the political realm through notions of tribe that were put into motion through colonialism. Again, notions of difference that have to be historicized by thinking about the distinction between tribe, between ethnicity, between race. The category of the indigenous, so valorized in decoloniality studies and movements in Latin and North America, is therefore less readily available to us in Africa as that which is outside of the colonial. The indigenous itself as a category is shaped by the colonial. And this is part again of the legacy that we inherit, where you could not continue to want to produce Macaulay's Indian man, brown in taste and European in sensibilities, when you had to think of difference in this way as the native could not become like you, This was the foundation of the Universities Extension Act of 1959, which went along the grain of this venture to create ethnicized institutions for Africans and racialized institutions for whites, for Indians, and for coloreds. The challenge in some ways in our part of the world is this: how do we decolonize knowledge without re-inscribing colonial conceptions of difference, while at the same time not sublating difference into a placeless cosmopolitanism, which variously non-racialism and others could be said to be moving towards? Apartheid education was the answer to a problem. It answered the problem by reinscribing difference in order to produce political subjects who internalize this difference and this inferiority. The challenge for our educational transformation in some ways is twofold. Then, how, in Dipesh Chakrabarty's phrase, to provincialize Europe, also to provincialize the critiques of Europe, and secondly, how to decolonize the concept and practice of difference, but not surrender to it, but rather to render it less a category of power and domination and make it more a category of plurality, so that we can begin to think comparatively across traditions of thought, of histories of power and domination, and most of all towards futures. But by that I do not mean necessarily that I think we can think the world a better place by producing mere diversity in thought. That would be a dangerous hubris of intellectuals, to conflate thinking the world differently with the political acts which actually make the world a different place. Thank you. Sorry, I went on.
Thank you so much. Am I
Too long.
Okay? No, because I think we were riveted and we started a bit late. You know, they say when you learn, right, when somebody tells you, I'm not going to offend you, they normally are going to offend you in the worst way. So Suren says, I'm not going to be sophisticated. And then, of course, he gave us a lot to think with. So I'd like to open it up to questions. Maybe I can start. I was wondering about, so I find this quite productive, right? The way you're talking about the difference, right, between conquest and assimilation versus conquest and the establishment of difference, kind of conquest and segregation. So the way I understood you is actually for more nuance and more comparison, not to obliterate everything as if, you know, there's no kind of force, but actually to identify the kinds of power, the logic of power that's going on. Oh God, actually it's not a question. That's just what I understood. I read your paper. I don't know if anybody have questions. I'll have to come to it. Maybe in terms of your critique, okay, maybe I can ask you. In terms of your critique of, you know, that's where decoloniality presents a kind of indigeneity, right? We're going to recover something that's lost. And I agree with your critique of them. But by taking the other approach, which is a very much, I see it as coming from a kind of post-colonial approach, which says that actually, no, because the categories of the indigenous is itself a product of a colonial power, so therefore we just have to see how that works. Now between these two, is there not somewhere else, right? Where, on the other hand, because we also know that power is not in a one-to-one relation with subjects, right? It is much more diffuse. So what do we do about the fact that people do have different practices, different ways of relating to, say, time, memory, you know, and that maybe capitalism is not the only game in town, right? No matter how powerful it might be. So even someone like Chakrabarty at the end of the day does end up reproducing this idea that, you know, there is only this way. So do you think that between the strong post-colonial and a strong decolonial, that there's something productive in thinking about other archives, actually, archives, but obviously archives of orality and other kinds of things. Not,
Yeah, thanks. I mean, you know, the challenge in some ways is that I sort of want to be clear. I think that what I'm thinking about is what happens when you universalize certain categories that have a subversive charge in one place, but do not necessarily travel well to other places. So I think there's a hugely important movement around indigeneity in the settler colonies in North America. That is a very important movement that does draw attention to these minoritized, now almost Bantustanized remnants really of the communities that were decimated. And to ask serious questions about what do people have to offer that could be different to how we think about political life, about sociality, about our relationship, very importantly, to nature, the ecological questions that are coming out of indigenous movements in Latin America are very important. My concern was to just say that that is an important moment, a set of interventions that we need to think about in that particular context. But we can't necessarily translate the category of indigenous as inherently a progressive category into the African context without paying attention to how indigeneity was constructed, was deployed in the African context. And that doesn't necessarily mean, I think, that one is saying that that these ways of being, of thinking, of cosmologies, of identity, of relations between people, time, and so on, are just simply invented by colonialism. They're not, and there are many instances where there's something else available as resources to think about different political possibilities. But they have to be thought of in relation to what colonialism did to them in some ways. So it's not necessarily, one can talk about, for example, let's just say the category of ethnicity and different kind of, whether you call it cultural ways of being, rituals, and so on and so forth. There was a strong argument in the 1970s that went along the lines that colonialism invented tribalism. And it sort of wanted to say you have to get rid of all these categories. They're all tainted, they're all backward. Within conventional sort of modernist discourse, they were backward. For Marxists, they were backward because they do not correspond to producing the proletarian subject. And there was of course a problem with that too, because what colonialism did was not necessarily to invent these. It was, of course, to reshape and recraft, right? So it was to make patriarchal things that were not, to take away the structures of accountability that might have been there, to refashion it as a centralized form of power to be backed up. So the challenge in some ways is not a retrieval project, but is to reform, rethink what was there before the colonial. Now that is a very heated debate in South African historiography itself, because often what scholars will tell you is that the pre-colonial is only available to us through the colonial archive. So our challenge lies there. Has the colonial archive not already intruded upon, contaminated, constructed its own version, its own fantasy of the pre-colonial? And that is a very important argument to take into account. But I think there are movements now across the continent which are beginning to say we need that we can't stop there. We can acknowledge that problem, but we need to think not necessarily about the pre-colonial, because the pre-colonial immediately already as a category privileges the colonial. There's what came before colonialism, and there's what came after colonialism. Whereas in cognate studies in other parts of the world, you have, for example, things like medieval studies, right? Which are more positive and affirmative categories through which you think of a past that was there, through which historical processes are dynamic, through which political formations exist, through which there were practices of conquest, through which there were incorporations and the making of identities and cognate groups and so on and so forth, larger political entities. But you're not necessarily in that already, in that naming of it, saying that this is all the product of the colonial as the central author around which you build what was before and what came after. So the work coming out of places in the Timbuktu manuscripts, for example, because one of the arguments, of course, was that we can't construct a pre-colonial past because we have an oral tradition in Africa, there's no written tradition, and now there's work that is beginning to trouble that and to say, look, there are these oral written archives. Two, we're saying that argument often rested on a separation of North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa as two distinct parts, and the argument emerging out of scholars working around the Timbuktu manuscripts in Mali and other places is to see, in fact, this goes back to arguments that had been made by people like Shaheed and Tayob and others, that you have to see the continent as a geography and not as a race, in that sense, right? That you have to see Egypt as part of Africa and not as this thing that Martians came and created wonderful signs of civilization that we have to attribute to people who came. So I think these are gestures that are there. And so I'm not necessarily, again, I don't want to make a blanket critique of saying there's a problem with the decolonial school and we have to go with the post-colonial. I'm just saying that one chooses whatever wants to choose, but to pay attention to what was specific about the African experience of colonialism, to the scholarship on colonialism. You know, it's very troubling for me when you see in Rosvogel and others an explicit commitment to saying we want to take the other parts of the colonized world seriously, but then no engagement with African scholars other than, for example, Achille Mbembe named there. There's no attempt to read into these other debates on the African continent. So I think we have to pay attention to those debates. And not agree with them, but think with them.
No, thank you. And we actually had someone from the one Timbuktu project who spoke to us earlier. Okay, Simone, and then sorry, first.
Yes, thank you very much. You've used the term the African experience a number of times, and that's, I mean, I'd like to speak to and then ask a question about the challenges within this idea of the African experience. And the first one, if I've understood, I mean, not you, if I've understood the decoloniality and the post-colonial debate, the major intellectual challenge, this is the way I conceptualize it, is to say, how do we in Africa address Eurocentric ways of thinking about the world and ourselves while we have been bred into that way of thinking? I mean, that's the way and I mean, from my experience, that certainly is a major challenge. And I mean, the question there is, I mean, the way I've expressed it doesn't make sense, but I'd like to carry on and ask about two other challenges of the African experience and how decoloniality and the post-colonial would address them. The first, I mean, I'm French, my mother was French speaking. I travel quite a lot in Francophone Africa. I've also traveled elsewhere in Africa, so I'm going to generalize a little. And I would say when, over the last 10 years, having been to a number of universities in Africa, largely sub-Saharan Africa, there is a major, huge challenge for an intellectual exchange in Africa, and that is language. Ironically, it is not an African language, it is French and English. So there is this huge challenge. And it really is. I mean, we have people up here who are bilingual and speaking their own home languages, but at the level of walking into the university in Lomé or in Bamako, I was in Bamako recently, you can't use English. In other words, how does one in the decoloniality or post-colonial address the issue of at least, let's leave Arabic out of it, at least in the African experience, it is two European languages themselves and the wall between them that has created this huge challenge. That's the first. The second is I have interests in development in Africa. I mean, largely World Bank kind of development in Africa, and there is a new narrative which is increasingly strong, and that is China. China comes in with state capital. So it's not capitalism. I mean, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. It's state capital. They've gone into the copper belt in Zambia, where their mines, some argue, have had a more positive effect on the Zambians from the copper belt than the private capitalist mining groups from elsewhere. So you've got this kind of fear in the East of an alternative form of development in Africa, which is also foreign, but it is not capitalist in the normal sense of the word. It's not trying to colonize as the Europeans try to colonize. And at least in certain places, at certain times, it may have a more positive effect than the West and capitalism. So my question really is, in terms of these two strands of thought which I'm bringing together, how does one use them to address this European language divide in Africa and the phenomenon of a new superpower which is not the colonial imperial superpower of the history of most of Africa?
This is, of course, two large and difficult questions. One, and this would be a very unsatisfying answer to many, but the one of the approaches, so if you were to look at the literature on decoloniality that is coming out and the arguments that scholars are making in there, the problem as they would see it is that, and agree with you in the sense that the languages through which we are thinking are European languages, that the kind of societies, the imagination of the nation state, for example, the obsession with state power, all of the sets of categories that we are using, that are, whether they be critical categories within, say, post-structuralist thought, Marxism, critical of Europe, remain within Europe, and therefore one has to think outside of those categories in order to make a different kind of world, right? And it's a very, at some level, a compelling argument. My own sensibilities are drawn towards the idea that kind of resolves the problem at a metaphysical level. In other words, I can intellectually think that, right? But what I would be interested in is much more probably along the lines of what you're highlighting, is that we exist within a particular set of configurations, of power relations, of histories, of genealogies, and we have to, in some ways, make and remake from within those constraints. So I think that, for example, the inheritances of languages are things that we negotiate in relation to whether those languages, because in some ways the problem with is not that the languages are there, is the problem has been that the languages have disabled people from thinking that because they do not speak those languages, they're therefore inadequate. So in some ways it's oftentimes the power relations within those languages, right? The question then is, do you think through those in some ways, right? So I'm much more to the idea that one will have to think through with what one has inherited, and that there's not necessarily an easy answer stepping out of these languages. One of the attempts that was made to address this was in Codessia, where the attempt was in 1973 to construct a Pan-African intellectual community, and to think of that community as the continent in its four parts, in the sense North Africa, East Africa, West Africa, Southern Africa, but also to think of it in terms of its linguistic inheritances: Lusophone Africa, Arabic Africa, Francophone Africa, and Anglophone Africa, and to have meetings where people were going to start to be able to communicate through translators, through translation work with each other. So that's a difficult and ongoing project. And I think, to me, it's in those gestures one is going to have to work to bridge the Anglophone-Francophone divide through translation, for example. But I'm not necessarily, I'm not persuaded that one just steps out of that in a very easy way. Similarly, I think that the kind of proposition of what China represents, again, is a set of questions we have to ask about, because there's a new configuration of power that's unfolding. And this is not just within the African continent. Some say this is a new global configuration of power, right? So that there is a shift towards the East in a way that is kind of disrupted a lot of the hegemonic sensibilities within Europe, within America, the anxieties, some would argue, around white supremacist movements in the US, and the kind of rise of figures like Donald Trump, Make America Great Again, speak to that not as strength but as weakness in a sense, right? So there's a shifting cartography of power in that sense. And how we negotiate it, again, is things that we have to do work on, to think about, to encourage research on. My worry is if you have a blanket analysis of the world as where you know already the zone of being and non-being, you know who the good guys are and the bad guys, you're not inquiring into the specificities of power and how it is tactile, how it is changing, how its languages are not just substitutable, how its categories are not just proxies for other categories, but that they're actually, when you use race, it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as class, it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as religion there. So I would just say it means we have to do actual research in order to investigate those problems that you're noting in some ways, because we don't know. China does represent a different kind of force in the continent, and it's what it's doing in different parts of the continent are different things also.
Thanks for that. We recently found out last week, we had somebody was doing an intellectual biography of Hachim Afeche. There are a lot of his students, because of course he wasn't allowed to come to South Africa, a lot of his students that actually took his work up have been writing in Arabic.
Yeah.
They were telling me about it. So it's a whole genealogy. Okay, still formulating. Pilay.
I just wanted to know, in this literature, why is it that being historically specific, the specificities, why is that controversial at all? Because it would seem quite obvious to any reader of history that there's been different types of colonialism, even within the African continent itself, and not every colonialist was doing the exact same kind of thing, although, you know, they're all together in the sense of foreign domination of people who were already there, or bringing in people from elsewhere too. But yeah, these are all the things that you were mentioning in the narratives, the developments of these colonialisms is a bit different. So what was the impetus behind this overgeneralization, this universalization of the issue in decolonial and post-colonial literature?
The argument has been that if you think of colonialism in very specific ways, so for example, if you say colonialism happened between 1500 and 1960 or something like that, right? And that with independence, that's the end of colonialism. So the argument has been that if you think of it in those empirical sensibilities, or through that empirical sense, as a specific form of rule that has a beginning date, but that then has an end date, what you are doing is you're closing off the possibility of thinking of how colonialism lives on in the present in the world. So they would want to argue that even though juridical colonialism ends with independence, for example, the structure of inequality in the world continues to this day, that you have certain powerful states who might have been the same states that were leading empires and imperial formations, who still now seem to have impunity and immunity from international legislation, from ICC rulings, from General Assembly condemnations, still have veto powers, etc., etc. So they would want to find a way to name that continuity, because the formal structures of colonialism do not exist. Now, of course, the likes of Kwame Nkrumah and others had identified that as a problem and called it neocolonialism. And this view would and neocolonialism was primarily premised on the idea that that you had flag independence, but you didn't have economic independence, right? And your dependency, therefore, so dependency theory in Latin America was an important intervention in that. These scholars, of course, come out of that tradition in some ways, but for them, the problem with dependency theory, the work of Wallerstein, of Samir Amin, others, was that it is too focused on the economic dependency. It misses the realm of the intellect, of the what they're calling epistemic violence, the realm of ideas, the ways in which people were thought about, and so that's that they want to correct that emphasis on the economic by saying it's not colonialism, it's coloniality, and coloniality of being is the category through which. So that's as best as I can say. This is why they would say that. Maybe, yeah.
I'm glad you just mentioned Kwame Nkrumah, because my question was, to what extent do the decolonial theorists really engage the moments of African liberation? And obviously, there's an African liberation movement, and obviously that one can make arguments, plausible arguments, that precisely certain it's flag it's flag independence, but not real independence, or so on. But the variety of attempts at serious kind of serious liberation. Serious liberation from colonialism. Is that written off? Is it engaged by the decolonial scholars? Insofar as this paradigm, this theory has been imported or used, does it engage those traditions at all? And the related question is the extent to which those movements were shaped and related to kind of Cold War and to traditions from not as far east as China, but of course from the Eastern Bloc. The extent to which, you know, there's a different model of liberation. Is that colonialism as well? Does that count as Western epistemology?
So from my engagement, I mean, Sabelo Ndlovugachene is I think the most productive of the scholars working in South Africa on making this argument. And in his work, he does work very carefully through, for example, the different moments, both in the intellectual moments and the political moments on the continent. He talks about the Ibadan School. He talks about the independence movement. He talks about the development of neocolonialism. He talks about those attempts. But then he writes about them in a way that ultimately says they were important, but they just didn't go far enough, and they weren't, therefore, genuine is the word he uses, right? And to me, in some ways, you know, this is part of the problem, because one has to think about what are the conditions under which those moments failed, for example, right? Otherwise, you get back into the kind of way of thinking, which is you just have to think this thing properly, right? And my argument, of course, is that we think the world from within particular sets of configurations. When independence movements, with the anti-colonial movements, took over, you know, became independent states, whether they be in Tanzania, whether they be, I mean, the kind of major examples, Thomas Sankara and others that are inspiring for many people. What are the conditions under which these fail? That one has to think about that very carefully, right? So that's when you identify. I think there is something to say, and I'm encouraging that, to say that there is a realm of power within discourse that is about the epistemological order, about the all of that is really important. But whether one resolves the problem at that level is the question, right? And I think movements that have attempted to do that have not simply failed because they haven't thought it through properly, because they think it through in a world that they have to negotiate, and who reacts to what they do, right? We see it now. I mean, it's going on around us.
If I just, when you said genuine, I mean, you triggered an idea of Heidegger and the jargon of authenticity, and I wonder if there's in this a kind of hidden Heideggerianism to which you're positing a different kind of reason. So just a comment.
It's worth thinking.
Stephen?
Yeah, I'll never really formulate this because this is such a rich talk. And extremely sophisticated and very important, and don't know where to enter it except I'm going to choose one entry point, which is the politics of location. I mean, you have this throwaway line about where these guys live and work, and that's not insignificant, I think. And because I'm thinking about the South African intellectual who somehow, particularly from the left, who has a sense of the state being very important and a commitment to a modernist project, which is unfashionable. It is more fashionable to deconstruct epistemological violence, which is there, but we have to go the next step because we live in a space where the state isn't thoroughly discredited. It actually is an indigenous state to some degree. Those who were assimilated are now in power. In Lovedale College, ANC, you can see where this has gone, and they're trying to make the state work. So I'm saying there's something about the particularity of the politics of location, of the intellectuals, because when I think of Escobar, as much as I do like his post-development critique, I teach it, there is no sense of the next step. You know, there's a sense that development is in moves. Wolfgang Sachs, Esteban, Mignolo is a complete detachment from responsibility for this. Exit the Enlightenment. You can't sit here at a state university and say, well, let's exit the Enlightenment. So I'm just thinking about that sense of, after sort of really laying out epistemic violence, what's the next step from a place like this?
No, I mean, the other person, of course, is the other Scott. What's his name? Seeing Like a State. Right? Which is, I like those critiques, but I have the same worry that, although he's much more explicit that he's an anarchist.
I don't know. Is there any other questions? Oh, yeah, right.
Thing as well. Suren, it's very interesting. I'm thinking through this idea of epistemology institutions, and I'm particularly interested in universities. So when you mentioned and language, because you have a little bit on Simon. And it's interesting. You made this observation. You don't know why they are all in literature departments, and it makes me wonder. Thinking particularly from the institutional space of the university, how the category of indigenous gets kind of codified in language. And the interesting thing about our situation now, since 1994, is how quickly the kind of fight back in Afrikaans, the defense of Afrikaans has been rearticulated in terms of indigenous. Right? Afrikaans is now very much, yes, what it was about difference, but now all of a sudden Afrikaans is indigenous. So why is it possible, and I've also been thinking, recently I've been reading a historian of science, which brings out very clearly to me the kind of the paradoxical status of Spanish in the global university. And it strikes me that there's a sense in which Spanish is a kind of subaltern language of science and a powerful language of literature. In the sense that obviously, we've got all these novels and this unified continental language. Benedict Anderson says it was the first place where nationalism started and stuff like that. And yet, in the 100 years since English has replaced the so-called triumvirate of English, German and French, Spanish isn't featured. Spanish, Russian has been there, Japanese has been there, but the power of English in science and the way in which English comes to codify the indigeneity of the university is quite specific in our situation. I don't know whether what more you've thought about sort of the role that the university plays.
Well, I think you've thought about it more than me, this particular question. But as you know, the university reproduces, it's a place of challenge and counterpower, but it also reproduces power. So it's a good index in some ways for us to think about what languages carry power, which languages are recognized. And you have these massive, histories of language policies changing, which tell you something. So when Ataturk does away with a certain script and replaces it overnight with another script, the modernist imagination that's at work in that act, other people's arguments that certain languages are foreign and some are indigenous, opens up a kind of other debates. Of course, there are languages that are local but then written in foreign scripts. So the Timbuktu project, for example, the script is Arabic, but the language is Ajami, it's an indigenous language. So, I mean, these are deeply complex questions which I don't know what to, at this point, say.
We come to the end.
All right.
Close. Is there anybody else who haven't asked other you want to take your time? Well, thank you so much. And we'll see you again 10 years.
10 years.
No, hopefully sooner than that.